Hello, how are you? And welcome to today's podcast. Today we'll be exploring the development of surgery in the early 20th century, looking particularly closely at the revolutionary work of Harold Gillies at Sidcup Hospital and the impact of the First World War. This period was extremely transformative for surgery, with new techniques being thrust into the limelight and the practices of the past entirely disintegrating. What me and my guest Paul are going to decide is which factor was most accountable for this. Was it the revolutionary work of Harold Gillies or the outbreak of a world war? Please refer to the accompanying board throughout the episode. I've compiled a case study of one of Gillies' most notorious patients, Walter Yeo, on there, and it also contains many visual supplements that enrich the history of Harold Gillies that we're discussing today and help to demonstrate quite how remarkable an impact surgical advancement had on patients. Before we get going, I'd just like to take this opportunity to introduce today's guest, Paul, my dad and an avid amateur historian and lover of all modern British history.
Hello.
So, Paul has done his homework today in preparation for this episode, and he's come with a few questions that an amateur historian learning about this topic for the first time might have. So we'll touch base with him throughout the episode. And just to make sure you all keep a listening ear, we'll round off with a quick quiz. So, listeners, your challenge is to beat Paul's score in the quiz. So, when researching, I found that the current historiography on First World War surgery is centred around three remits. The first being the work of Harold Gillies, the second being new surgical techniques, such as the tube pedicle, and the third being societal attitudes towards facial injuries. Whilst there could be more coverage on other individuals like war artist Henry Tonks, the historiography was overall well-evidenced, comprehensive, and is being continually updated. It's not particularly vast in quantity, and after conducting my own survey amongst fellow students, I realised this further. My results showed that 90% were aware of more familiar war narratives, such as patients of shell shock and trench foot, but only 20% were familiar with the work of Gillies and the birth of modern plastic surgery. Because the narrative of facial surgeons and patients is somewhat a hidden history, it seems apt to conduct a project that gives the topic long-awaited representation and highlights the enormous individual contribution Harold Gillies has made to surgery and science. So Harold Gillies was a New Zealand-born surgeon, graduating from the University of Cambridge with a degree in medicine by 1904. By 1910, he was a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons, a widely respected member of the medical community, and he had bright career prospects ahead as an ear, nose and throat surgeon. However, there was something that set Gillies apart from other medics of his time. Besides his playful and sometimes overindulgent tendencies that involved a lot of beer and golf, Gillies was a determined man with a steely intelligence that manifested itself in his contributions to surgical development. The outbreak of the First World War entirely dismantled the trajectory of Gillies' career, taking him straight to Boulogne and the work of Auguste Valadier. In his book, The Principles and Art of Plastic Surgery, published in 1957, Gillies describes his younger self as so bursting with enthusiasm about plastic surgery, and this was after having learned from the greats of the field like Valadier, Lindman and Moristin in 1915. Andrew Bamji is a historian and founder of the Gillies Archives, and he places specific emphasis on Gillies' unique personal traits that set him apart from his peers. In an article that Bamji wrote for Trauma, he speaks of how Gillies became a friend to his patients and gave his time to review them upon request, and consistently offered rehabilitative services. Gillies adopted a threefold approach within his work. He served the army, his patients, and science. So with this and Bamji's opinions, we have the idea of Gillies as a companion as well as a surgeon and a friend as well as an advisor. Bamji describes him as kindness itself to his patients, who would often request photographs with him as a memento of their time together, particularly at Sidcup. There's examples of these postcards, as they were called, on the accompanying board. So, therefore, Bamji is utterly correct in his flattering depiction of Gillies' character, and even more correct when he stresses the notion that Gillies was a healer first and a surgeon second, and that to really understand him you must look behind the surgeon and to the visionary. Bamji has dedicated his life's work to creating the Gillies archive, so it's unsurprising that his work is reliable and deeply supports the argument that Harold Gillies himself was the primary catalyst in surgical advancements in the early 20th century. On top of that, Bamji received a glowing review from the initially sceptical South African critic Henri Delport, who he sought to decide if Bamji's accreditations were actually warranted. However, he ultimately praised Bamji for his exceptional ability to balance the narratives of all of those at Sidcup and for shedding light on the lesser-told stories of South African patients and surgeons, as he does with the story of Walter Brown, for they seldom receive representation. Delport highlights Bamji's successful use of visual sources to build a picture for the reader, because Bamji includes a lot of primary photographs throughout his books. And this really resonated with me, hence the accompanying board for this podcast. Ultimately, Bamji does extraordinary work in restoring public consciousness to the topic, with his work Faces from the Front.
Wow. I've never even considered checking the validity of the sources I'm engaging with. That's a really interesting point. Is there anything more that supports the idea that it was Harold Gillies himself that mobilised changes to surgery in the early 1900s and not just wartime necessity?
Yes. So weighing up the reliability of your sources is a vital element of coming to an informed judgment. And if you're just getting started on your historical research journey, Paul, I suggest looking out for the types of sources that a historian uses. So primary sources are best, and steer clear from anybody with a particular political or social bias. And answer to your second question, yes, there is lots more evidence. As part of the most recent historiography, Richardson contends the idea that Harold Gillies exploded the idea of surgery, it was known, and he traded the performative, flamboyant exhibitionism that 18th and 19th century surgeons displayed for a focus on gentility and control in the theatre. This argument is validated when you look at the contrasting depictions of flamboyant Victorian surgeons versus the calculated procedures that took place under Gillies. Again, this is visible on the accompanying board. However, Richardson also argues that multidisciplinary cooperation did not exist properly until World War II, and will later prove this claim to be extremely wrong. So this is, again, Paul, where you've got to understand that only part of certain historians' work is useful in supporting the argument, and only part of Richardson's work is useful in supporting this argument. So by 1916, there was an urgent need for purpose-built centres for maxillofacial surgery. This is where Sidcup Hospital becomes part of our narrative. The building of it was driven by the persistence of Harold Gillies and fuelled by the flood of casualties from the Battle of the Somme in 1916. And that's why Queen's Hospital Sidcup was opened. There are endless benefits to it. Gillies constructed a team of equipped surgeons, had large capacity, extreme efficiency, and the quantity of patients allowed for technological advancement on the job. However, the biggest change to surgery, I would argue, was Gillies' employment of multidisciplinary cooperation at Sidcup Hospital. This very much supports the argument that it was Gillies' work as an individual that accelerated surgical development, because no other surgeons were using this technique. Like I say, in Europe, the teachers of Gillies, Valadier, did not use this technique, and they would learn to send their most complex cases to Gillies at Sidcup, knowing that if he couldn't solve the problem, no one else could. The success of Sidcup, according to Bamji and other historians, was down to its multidisciplinary nature. This essentially means the outsourcing of skills to achieve a cohesion of the best professionals for each element of the procedure. So Gillies has dentists, physicians, radiologists, dental technicians, artists, sculptors, and photographers. The last three were usually used to plan the reconstructions and record the results. This meant that each patient received the highest level of care, instead of the surgeon working on elements of the body that he was not best trained in. Maxillofacial surgeries were completed and recorded meticulously. Surgeons learned the advantages and mistakes of their work comprehensively and quickly. Sandy Callister has written about how the precise sketches of Henry Tonks and medical photographers were accurate and gave fast permanence to remarkable medical cases. However, she's somewhat disappointed by the fact that this work served solely as a pedagogy. This means that they were resigned to being methods of teaching to future surgeons, so the work of tonks and wall photographers had their artistic potential diminished and forgotten by those outside the medical world. Sculptors created the most realistic masks at Sidcup because many soldiers were too fearful to reveal what the London Evening Standard referred to as the dreadful abyss beneath the mask in 1918. But Sidcup was a remarkable place and saw over 11,000 operations performed on some 5,000 servicemen in the wartime period and beyond, making it the beating heart of facial reconstructive surgery in England and the beacon of hope that gave men burned and maimed their humanity back.
Gosh, what a dreadful abyss. And seems like a really harsh comment from such a major newspaper.
I know, it's incredibly coarse, that comment, but it's very indicative of social attitudes towards facial injuries at the time. A 21st century audience, like we say, would struggle to comprehend the judgment that maxillofacial patients experienced. Unlike their fellow limb amputees, who were, rightly so might I add, seen as heroes, those with damaged faces were pitied. Quite a strange phenomenon that we're not really used to now, but they lost their humanity and their identity, and their injuries were seen as impolite and uncomfortable by those in society. And the newspapers show us this, and they give us perfect evidence, like the London Evening Standard. On top of this, Henry Tonks made a request to keep all of his paintings private, as he thought they were too graphic and not for public consumption, which is indicative that they were created for a sort of medical purpose and not for pleasure. Bienoff, another historian, says that there was no British Otto Dix to create the reality of facial injuries, and Otto Dix is a German painter who created very realistic images of injured men. If anything, these men became the forgotten victims of war and were removed from educational narratives for the discomfort and unease that the images stirred. And that's why I've intentionally included a visual companion for the podcast, so that these paintings and photos don't remain hidden and the men within them regain the humanity that they should never have lost.
Yes, excellent. It's so important that these men aren't forgotten and remembered for their heroism and courage.
Yeah, exactly.
So, other than the employment of multidisciplinary cooperation, what other advancements were made in surgery? I mean, I'm interested, I thought the first plastic surgery or rhinoplasty had taken place by this point in time, hadn't it?
Yes, yeah. So evidence of the first rhinoplasty dates to the 16th century, and there were sort of attempts at it throughout the following centuries. But what Bamji and fellow historians stress is that Gillies advanced modern plastic surgery, so plastic surgery as we know it now, because they had anaesthetic, blood transfusion and other common medical techniques were available that weren't in the 16th century. The new techniques that were used at Sidcup that are quite revolutionary were the tube pedicle, which you might have heard of, the temporalis transfer, arterial flaps, epithelial inlays for the reconstruction of eyelids, and nasal reconstructions. Gillies' most famous development was definitely the tube pedicle, although Bamji briefly discusses a contention from a South African surgeon, Amard, that he invented this practice. But Delport, who I mentioned earlier, the critic, he was disappointed in his review of Bamji that no conclusion was reached regarding the truth of this contention. Although he does he forgives Bamji because access to South African sources from this time is notoriously difficult. But this kind of dispute shows that there was an element of healthy competition that existed in the surgical world. But such lack of names, really, other than Gillies, in the historiographical narratives is testament to the abnormally transformative contributions of Gillies himself.
Wow, yeah, that's really interesting. And Gillies continued to develop more complex procedures throughout the war, like temporal muscle flaps, and surgeons on the continent were far from mastering those techniques.
Yes, yeah, no, they really were.
And he had a major impact on surgery in the interwar period, years too, completing the first successful female-to-male gender reassignment. I think it was 1946.
Yeah, no, it was 1946. And he documents all of this in his book, The Principles and Art of Plastic Surgery. But ultimately, Richardson, Bamji, Bienoff all agree that the war provided ample opportunity for Gillies to experiment and execute new techniques. and that without such high patient numbers, he might not have been able to do this. This is true, of course, because over 65,000 men experienced facial injuries in those 4 horrific years. However, I think you'd agree with me, Paul, that the way that Gillies utilised this opportunity led to surgical developments and provides reason for why he, as an individual visionary, is responsible for the great advancements in modern plastic surgery during the early 20th century. Few, if any, war surgeons of the time employed such regimented structures like multidisciplinary cooperation, purpose-built hospitals, and detailed recording, and certainly none of them enjoyed the same success as Gillies. So now we're just going to move on to our quick 30-second quiz. So now it is time for the 30-second quiz. Question 1, Paul. What were 3 of Gillies' main advancements?
Okay, multidisciplinary cooperation.
Correct.
The hospital, purpose-built hospital.
What was the name of that?
Sidcup Hospital.
Perfect.
And tube pedicle.
Oh, very nice and precise. 3 great answers. Question 2. Who was Henry Tonks? It's quite a hard one.
I know this. He was a war artist, a trained surgeon too, hence his anatomical precision.
Oh, wow, you have done your homework. Question 3. What was pedagogy?
Ooh, I think you've got me on this one. Pedagogy.
It's a tough one.
No, sorry, I'm going to have to pass on that one.
So pedagogy is use of something as a teaching method, and in the context of the podcast, it was when the use Tonks's war sketches were being used to teach future surgeons about surgery. Finally, question 4. How many surgeries took place at Sidcup Hospital in the war years?
I was paying attention. Around 11,000.
Perfect. So Paul got 3 out of 4, and that rounds our podcast off very nicely. See if you can beat Paul's score in the quiz, and please do look at the accompanying board while you're listening to the podcast. Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. And finally, I'd just quickly like to give thanks to the historians that informed this podcast, starting with Bamji, Bienhoff, Bound-Alberti, Callister, Delport, Kneebone, Richardson, Swain, the Yeo Society, and of course Harold Gillies' book himself. This is all available on the back of the board in a more formal bibliography. Thanks for listening. Bye.